Hi, in this video we're going to look at 8 ways to adapt your Aeropress recipe. When I was putting together the videos about brewing using Aeropress, I was slightly concerned because when we do brewing demonstrations and brewing guides, it can sometimes feel really prescriptive, like there's only one way to do something. And with the Aeropress in particular, there are lots of ways to get to an end result. And in this video, I wanted to kind of explore some of the things you can do, the ways you can tweak your recipe to explore the Aeropress a little bit more. And the way I've gone about it is I've looked back over 9 years worth of the World Aeropress Championships. And I've looked at the top 3 recipes for each of those 9 years. And I've looked for kind of trends, what were people doing, what were people trying, to see if we can learn something from the championship winning recipes. And I've come up with 8 things that you might like to try. And I would encourage you to pick 1 or 2 and adapt your recipe to see what happens. You might get a great result, you might not, but I guarantee you'll learn something along the way. So here's my top 8 things to try. The first is around water temperature. The average water temperature used over all the winning recipes over 9 years was around about 83 degrees Celsius, which is significantly lower than other brewing methods. That creates a brew with less acidity, and I was experimenting with this. I had a brew at 84 degrees and I had a brew at 94 degrees, and that 84 degree brew really lifted the fruity floral tones in the coffee I was drinking. Granted, it was an African coffee, it was an Ethiopian natural, but it really gave a great lift to the fruit and floral tones. Now, to understand what's happening there, you need to understand a little bit about coffee extraction. And when we brew coffee, we don't get a consistent type of extraction throughout the whole of the brew cycle. We get different flavor compounds throughout the process. The first things we're ever going to brew out of a coffee are the fruit acids. After that, as the brew time develops, then we spend more time extracting. We're going to get more sweetness, we're going to get slowly more body, and we're going to get more balance in the cup. And if we keep going, if we keep extracting more and more, we end up pulling out bitter tones and drying tones in the cup. Now, using cooler water slows down the pace at which we move through those different flavor compounds. If you use hotter water, you'll get through those flavor compounds much, much quicker. A lot of the recipes used a much higher ratio of coffee to water than perhaps I would tended to have used. Typically, the ratios were about 1 part coffee to 11 parts water. That relates to about 90 grams of coffee to a litre of water. Or typically, in a 200 ml Aeropress, about 18 grams of coffee. So I encourage you to play around with that coffee dose, updose to see what happens. Part of that rationale between that kind of updosing, I think, goes back to that water temperature. If we're trying to lift those fruit acids, they're quite light, and sometimes the coffee can feel a little bit weak, but by updosing, we're kind of lifting the strength of the whole brew. 77% of the recipes I looked at had a bloom phase. This is where a little bit of water was added to the brew and the coffee was allowed to bloom or release its gases for a period of time. Typically, 50 to 60 grams of water were used and a bloom time of about 30 seconds was allowed. Now, I had to go at this. I put 2 Aeropresses side by side. I went for a bloom versus no bloom, and I have to admit the bloom had more body and more sweetness. Less common, but kind of started to creep in, was the use of different types of water. So you could see some of the recipes specified a particular bottled water or even water from a particular region. It's really interesting to use different waters when you brew coffee. Now, we're located in a very soft water area here, and soft water tends to lift the acidity in coffee, and it also makes it quite difficult sometimes to unpick or taste flavour in the coffee itself. Flavours will be subdued quite a lot. Often at the roastery here, we add minerals to our water to lift it into the perfect coffee brewing zone, and that allows us to really understand our roasting and the coffee we're drinking. So if you're in a soft water area, you might try to play around with some bottled water. Something like Volvic is interesting to try. If you're in a hard water area, then making sure that you filter that water will give you kind of a similar experience. Nearly all of the recipes specified a plunge speed, and many of them went for a slow plunge of at least 30 seconds. So I'd encourage you to play around with the plunge, speeding up and slowing down, and actually time it to get a degree of consistency into your brewing. Had a go earlier, I went for a really fast plunge of about 10 seconds against a very slow plunge of about 45 seconds. And there was a big difference between the two coffees. The fast plunge had a lot more body, or perceived body. Basically, I think a lot more very fine sediment got into the coffee, and it gave a perception of body in the cup. So if you like coffee with a bit of body, go for a faster plunge. If you want a lighter body and to retain that fruit flavour in your cup, go for a much slower plunge. A handful of recipes I looked at played around with the filter itself. So rather than going for the paper filter, they used metal filters to create a different type of brew. Or we saw a couple of recipes that used double papers, or even a paper and a metal filter combined. Again, side-by-side brews, if you use a paper filter, paper absorbs the oils in the coffee, so therefore the resulting cup underneath is going to be missing those oils, whereas if you go for a metal filter, you are going to get those oils coming into the cup. And again, when I had a go at these side-by-side, same brew conditions, but a paper versus metal filter, there was definitely more body coming through on the metal filter. In the past 3 or 4 years, there's been a trend of brewing a little bit stronger and diluting to taste. And this is something else you might want to have a go at. So all this updosing and bigger weights of coffee at the start and extending the brew time perhaps will create a slightly stronger brew. And having a stronger brew is okay, because by adding water, you can dilute it down to the kind of coffee you enjoy drinking. If you've got a weak brew, there's not a lot you can do about it. So I'd encourage you to maybe use a slightly finer grind, extend your brew time, and updose that coffee. And if it feels a bit strong, try adding a set amount of water at the end to see if it makes a difference to your brew. The final thing that started to creep in was discarding a certain amount of coffee at the end of the brew. Now, traditionally, I've always plunged as far as the hiss. So basically, all the water's gone through, and just as the air starts to come through, stop that brew process. There seems to be a trend of stopping sooner than that and discarding the last 30 or 40 grams of water in the Aeropress. And that's down to trying to avoid any over-extraction coming into the cup. So going back right at the start, when we were talking about fruit acids coming through, and then that sweetness, and that balance, and that increasing body, and finally that bitterness at the end, by discarding a little bit of water at the end, it ensures that we don't pull in any over-extracted bitterness. So there you go, 8 ways you can adapt your Aeropress recipe. Have a go, try one out, and please feel free to let me know how you get on. I'd love to know whether any of these have a positive or even a negative effect on your coffee drinking experience. If you've enjoyed watching this video, I'd really appreciate it if you can like, and obviously shares really help us spread the word about the things that we're doing. In the meantime, happy coffee brewing, and thanks for listening.